By 5 o'clock that Friday, my 11-year-old daughter had survived nearly 3 hours of emergency surgery and been moved into the pediatric intensive care unit. She was no longer bleeding to death, but she had not opened her eyes, and a nurse was still checking the monitors every few minutes. My husband stood beside the PICU elevators with his car keys in one hand. "Colin, don't leave." I kept my voice low because 2 other families were sitting behind us, waiting for doctors to divide their lives into before and after. Evie just came out of surgery. His phone vibrated again. Celeste's name lit the screen. "I can't stay in these clothes. Please come now." I looked at the man who had taught Evie to read airport codes before she could multiply. "You're abandoning our daughter in intensive care to pamper the woman you're sleeping with?" Celeste says a creditor cornered her in a parking garage. "Her clothes are torn, she's terrified, and she hasn't eaten." "Then call the police for her. You are already in a hospital because somebody hit your child and drove away." He pressed the elevator button. "Colin, she is your mistress." The doors opened. He looked at me with a coldness I had spent months trying not to name. "She has doctors," he said. "My mistress needs me more." Then he stepped inside and let the doors close between us. At 5:47, a charge for $1,286 appeared on our joint card from Lark and Finch, the boutique Celeste had praised at a company dinner. At 7:18, another alert arrived from Calder House Stateroom. Colin was buying her clothes and dinner while our daughter lay under heated blankets with a fresh incision across her abdomen. He returned a little after 9. There was a valet stamp on the back of his hand and a narrow shopping receipt protruding from his coat pocket. At 9:18, Evie's fingers moved against mine. Her eyes opened slowly. The surgeon had told me the internal bleeding was controlled and that she was no longer in immediate danger. That did not mean she was well. It only meant I was allowed to hope she would live. "Mom," she murmured, and I wrapped both hands around hers. "I'm here." Her eyes moved past me to Colin. Hope lifted her face for 1 second, then disappeared beneath months of missed calls and arrival briefings he no longer stayed to hear. "Am I an unwanted child, Mom?" she whispered. I squeezed her hand carefully around the IV tape. "No, you are the one Mom will always choose." The door opened before Colin could answer. 2 detectives stepped in with a hospital security supervisor. The woman in front showed us her badge, then looked directly at my husband. "Mr. Bennett, we need to speak with you about a silver Belden commercial SUV, fleet number 417. Colin went still. "Your credentials authorize that vehicle at 10:52 this morning," she continued. "At 11:36, it struck your daughter." He did not look shocked by the fleet number. He looked terrified of the name attached to it. "Before I tell you how my husband began treating our daughter like evidence instead of a child, I hope you are doing well wherever you are listening from. Stay with me, because what the police uncovered began months earlier with a paternity report and a piece of medical history someone had deliberately left blank. Please subscribe to the channel if you believe no child should ever have to earn the right to be chosen. To understand how we reached that night, I have to take you back 4 months earlier, to the last arrival briefing Evie still believed her father wanted to hear. She was standing over the dining table with a blue pushpin between her teeth and a folded index card in her hand. Our wall map was covered with thin red lines connecting Richmond to the cities Colin visited for work. Denver had just received a fresh pin, marked Den. "I have exactly 3 minutes, Evie told me. 1 achievement, 1 Denver fact, and 1 question. No rambling. You are 11. You are allowed to ramble. Dad says concise people sound prepared." She had earned an A on a geography project, learned that Denver was called the Mile High City, and chosen a question about whether the airport really looked like white mountain peaks. She rehearsed it twice before Colin's car entered the driveway. There had been a time when he would have sat down before taking off his coat. He used to call her from airport gates, mail her old luggage tags, and draw flight paths across the map with her. Their game had started when she mistook ATL for a secret code, and Colin told her every airport had its own language. That evening, He listened for less than a minute. Denver is exactly 1 mile above sea level, Evie began, smiling. I got an A on my project, and I wanted to ask if the roof at the airport really looks like snow-covered mountains. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and closed his laptop bag again. That's great, sweetheart. I need to call a client. You still have 2 minutes. Next time, he said, already turning away. I saw the disappointment settle behind her smile, but I did what I had learned to do in 16 years of marriage. I translated his absence into something kinder. Your dad has a lot happening at work. Save the card for after dinner. Evie nodded and slid it beneath the edge of the map. As Colin passed me, I noticed an adhesive bandage inside his left elbow. Blood draw? Executive health screening. Evie looked up immediately. She knew more about her father's medical history than most children knew about their parents' childhoods. You're not sick again, are you? No. He touched the bandage, then gave her a strained smile. Your Uncle Nolan gave me new blood a long time ago. It still works. Then he added quietly, I'm checking something I should have checked years ago. I stayed silent for her sake. That was how our family always described the stem cell transplant that had saved Colin when he was 21. Nolan had been the matching donor. Colin had survived the disease, but the treatment had left his fertility badly damaged. For years after our wedding, we lived by calendars, injections, blood tests, and carefully managed hope. By 2014, we had stopped treatment. I conceived naturally just before Colin left for a 7-week assignment. When he came home, I was about 9 weeks pregnant. We sat together at the obstetrician's office while the doctor explained the dates. Colin cried when he heard the heartbeat. He never doubted Evie then. The change had begun only recently, after Helix Bridge became a vendor for Belden Commercial and Colin met Celeste Rowan. I had first seen her at a company dinner 2 weeks before the Denver trip. She spoke about medical benefits and care navigation with polished confidence, but her real talent was making Colin feel like the most important person at the table. She laughed before he finished a story, remembered the name of every project he mentioned, and told him that very few executives understood people as well as he did. On the drive home, he mentioned her 4 times. I noticed. I did not accuse. I told myself professional admiration was not betrayal, and that suspicion without proof could damage a marriage as surely as a lie. After dinner that night, Evie brought Colin another index card. She had written PHX, DFW, and ORD across the front for his next trip. You can quiz me on the plane codes, she said. He tucked the card into his briefcase without reading it. Thanks, Evie. She watched him walk toward his office. Maybe he'll read it at the airport. Maybe, I said, even though I had begun to hate how often that word did the work truth should have done. A few minutes later, I heard Colin's office door open, then the shared printer in the hallway clicked awake. I assumed he had sent one of his work documents to print, so I crossed the hall to collect my client pages before they mixed together. The first sheet slid into the tray face-up. I saw Colin's name. I saw Evie's initials. Then I saw the line beneath them. Probability of paternity, 0%. My fingers went cold around the paper. Colin appeared behind me so quickly that I barely had time to turn. He pulled the report from my hand, shoved it into his briefcase, and locked the clasp. What is that? I asked. His face did not hold confusion. It held the terrible relief of a man who believed his worst fear had finally been proven. You should start thinking, he said, about what you're going to tell Evie. What exactly did you test? I asked. Colin kept one hand on the clasp of his briefcase, as if I might lunge for it. Evie was still in the dining room, quietly moving the Denver pin until it sat perfectly over Colorado. I lowered my voice. What kind of sample did they take from you? Who collected Evie's? Was either identity verified? His jaw tightened. You saw the result. I saw one line on a page. I'm asking about the process. He carried the briefcase into his office and set it on the desk. I followed, but I left the door partly open so Evie would not think we were hiding a fight from her. That was the kind of compromise I still believed made me a good mother. It was an informational test, he said. Not a court test. Then there was no formal chain of custody. There didn't need to be. I wasn't filing a lawsuit. I needed an answer. Why did you do it? He looked at me, as though the answer should humiliate me into silence. Because the doctors told us my chances of fathering a child were almost non-existent. Because I left for 7 weeks, and when I came home, you said you were 9 weeks pregnant. You were sitting beside me when the obstetrician explained gestational age. Pregnancy is dated from the first day of the last menstrual period, not from conception. You knew the dates fit. I knew what you told me. You heard it from the doctor. And now I have a report from a laboratory. The sentence was calm, which made it worse. Colin was not ranting or throwing furniture. He was doing what he did in business meetings when he wanted the room to believe the decision had already been made. I asked him who had arranged the test. Celeste recommended the vendor. There it was again, her name entering our marriage, as if it belonged there. She recommended a paternity test? She works with laboratories. I told her I had questions. She said there were discrete options. What sample did you give? They took blood. It was included with the executive screening. What did they take from Evie? A cheek swab. I told her it was part of an ancestry panel. I stared at him. You swabbed our child without telling me because a woman from one of your vendors suggested it? I am her legal father. I consented. You lied to her about what it was. I protected her until I knew whether there was anything to protect her from. The logic was polished enough to sound responsible until I looked past it. He had turned secrecy into care, and suspicion into evidence. Then let us do it properly, I said. An independent laboratory. Verified identities. Full medical histories. Chain of custody from collection to report. We can have counsel agree on the facility. His expression changed, not into doubt, but irritation. You want another test because you dislike the first answer. I want another test because the first one was designed for private information, not a legal conclusion. You want time. I want accuracy. You had 11 years to tell me the truth. I heard a small scrape behind me. Evie stood in the hall with one hand around the doorframe. Colin saw her and stopped, but not soon enough. I don't even know whose child I've been raising, he said. Evie's face did not crumple. That would have been easier. She looked from him to me, with the careful stillness she used when adults spoke too quickly, and she was trying to find the safest meaning. I walked to her, before Colin could add another sentence. Get your shoes, I said. You and I are having lunch out. But Dad just got home. I know he did. Did I do something wrong? You did nothing wrong. This conversation is not yours to fix. Colin called my name, but I did not turn back. For once, finishing the argument mattered less than ending Evie's exposure to it. At the diner, 3 blocks from my office, she ordered grilled cheese and peeled the crust into narrow strips. She usually filled silence with facts. That day, she asked whether Denver's elevation could make people dizzy, then whether Colin would still take his next trip. I answered only what I knew. When she finally asked about the paper, I told her it was an adult disagreement involving a test that needed to be checked. I did not tell her the report was wrong because I could not prove that yet. I did not tell her it was right because one page had frightened her father into treating uncertainty like a verdict. Dad looked at me like he didn't know me, she said. He is confused and angry. Is he angry at me? His choices are not your fault. She nodded, but children often nod when they understand the words and not the world behind them. The first thing Colin stopped doing was calling from airports. Then he missed the permission deadline for Evie's geography club trip because the form sat unsigned on his desk for 4 days. When I reminded him, he said I could sign it. The telescope in the backyard had developed a loose focusing knob. Evie placed a piece of blue painter's tape beside it with the words, "Dad, fix please," written in block letters. The tape curled in the June humidity, while the knob remained loose. She did not complain. She adjusted. Before Colin's trip to Dallas, she learned DFW and the difference between a city and a metropolitan area. For Chicago, she read about the river reversal and practiced pronouncing O'Hare, as though the airport itself might approve her. Every new fact made her brighter at the dinner table, and smaller everywhere else. Phoenix remained untouched on the schedule, a city she had not yet turned into another attempt to be chosen. I did not search Colin's phone. I did not open his private email or guess passwords. My work had taught me that evidence becomes dangerous when the person collecting it cannot explain how it was obtained. But Colin had left a copy of the report inside a household insurance folder in the shared cabinet. I found it while looking for Evie's dental claim. The document was thinner than I expected. There were no photographs, no verified identification, and no neutral witness listed for collection. Colin's blood sample had been routed from the executive screening. Evie's swab was identified by initials and a home collection code. The medical history section contained 3 checked boxes and 2 blank lines. No cancer treatment had been listed. There was no transplant history and no donor information. That evening, I placed the copy on the kitchen counter between us. "Did you tell them about Nolan's transplant?" Colin barely glanced down. "That was 22 years ago. That does not answer me. It has nothing to do with whether I fathered Evie." "How do you know?" "Because I'm not a geneticist, Mara, and neither are you. That is exactly why we should ask one." He folded the report once and returned it to the folder. "Celeste works in this field. She has no reason to lie." The ease with which he defended her landed harder than the accusation against me. "She has every reason to be careful," I said. "A careful person would have asked about a stem cell transplant before recommending a DNA test. You are reaching for anything that lets you avoid the obvious." "I am asking for a test that can survive questions. And I am done letting you control the questions." He walked away before I could ask why Celeste knew enough about our marriage to choose the laboratory, but somehow not enough about his medical history to complete the form. 3 nights later, Colin returned from Dallas. Evie had rebuilt her arrival briefing until every sentence fit on one index card. She waited beside the map in a navy baseball cap she had bought with her allowance. "Welcome home," she said. "I learned why DFW has its own postal designation, the Rangers one yesterday, and I can show you the route from your hotel to the airport without using the interstate." Colin looked at the cap, the card, and the red line she had drawn across Texas. Then he looked at me. "Did you coach her to imitate me?" Evie lowered the card. Her fingers closed over it until the paper bent down the middle. Later, after Colin shut himself in his office, she found me in the laundry room. She stood beside the dryer, with the crumpled briefing pressed to her chest. "How much more do I have to learn?" she asked, "before he knows I'm his?" I took the crumpled briefing from Evie's hands and smoothed it against the top of the dryer. "You do not have to learn one more thing to prove you belong to anyone," I told her. "You are not taking a test for your father's love." She searched my face as if there might be a second answer hidden behind the first. "Then why does he keep looking at me like I got something wrong?" Because he had chosen a piece of paper over 11 years of knowing her. Because every time she tried harder, he treated her effort as another reason to distrust me. I could not say any of that without handing her a burden that belonged to adults. "Your father is making choices from fear," I said. "That fear did not come from you, and you cannot fix it for him." The next morning, I called Joanne Keene, a family attorney whose firm had reviewed contracts for one of my clients. I did not ask her how to punish Colin. I asked what I could legally protect before his suspicion became an action against Evie. Joanne met me in a conference room 2 days later. I brought the copy of the report from the shared insurance cabinet, the household statements bearing both our names, and a written timeline of what Colin had said. I left his briefcase, phone, office files, and private accounts untouched. Joanne read the laboratory page twice. "This does not terminate anything," she said. "Colin is still Evie's legal father. He cannot waive an informational home test at the school, the insurance company, or a judge and erase custody or support. It says 0%. It says these two submitted samples were reported as incompatible. It does not prove who supplied them, how they were collected, or whether the correct medical history was considered. I pointed to the blood collection number. His sample came through an executive health screening. And Evie's? He told her it was an ancestry test. Joanne's mouth tightened. Ask him once, in writing, to agree to a properly supervised test. Keep the request calm. Do not accuse him of fraud, and do not discuss this with Evie beyond what she needs for her safety. I sent Colin the message from my business email, so there would be no argument about wording. I proposed an independent facility chosen through counsel, verified identification, complete medical disclosures, and a formal chain of custody. I also offered to place the cost in escrow until the results were complete. His answer arrived 43 minutes later. There is no legitimate reason to repeat a conclusive test. I will not participate in an effort to manufacture a different result. Joanne forwarded his refusal to the case file without comment. Through a referral from her office, I found Dr. Priya Garner, a genetic counselor who worked with an accredited forensic genetics laboratory. Our first consultation was by video. I expected her to begin with dates, fertility treatment, or the percentage printed on the report. Instead, she asked, "Has Colin ever received a blood transfusion, bone marrow transplant, or hematopoietic stem cell transplant?" The words pulled me back to Colin's bandaged arm and Evie's frightened question. "Your Uncle Nolan gave me new blood a long time ago. He received stem cells from his brother when he was 21, I said. Nolan was the donor. Dr. Garner leaned closer to her screen. Was that disclosed to the laboratory? I don't know. I opened the request form I had found with the insurance papers. The medical section had boxes for transfusion, transplant, and known donor history. The box labeled hematopoietic stem cell transplant was empty. I felt the first sharp rise of hope since seeing the report, but Dr. Garner stopped me before I could turn possibility into certainty. "This does not prove the conclusion is wrong," she said. "It does mean the sample may not answer the question Colin believes it answered. Because the blood could belong to Nolan? Not in the ordinary sense. After an allogeneic stem cell transplant, blood-forming cells can carry the donor's genetic profile. A blood sample may therefore reflect donor-derived DNA rather than the recipient's original germline profile." I looked again at the 0 on the report. Then Colin may have compared Evie to his brother. He may have compared her to a blood profile influenced by his brother's donated cells. We would need the transplant records, the original laboratory data, and carefully selected comparison samples before making any conclusion. She recommended an in-person consultation with Colin, me, Evie, and the medical records from his transplant. The laboratory would decide which samples were appropriate. She would not promise that hair, saliva, or any single source would solve everything without reviewing the history. That caution made me trust her more than the report Colin had accepted without question. I scheduled the consultation for 1:30 on Friday, September 25. Evie's school had an early release day for teacher training, and my office was less than a mile from the clinic. I planned to collect her after dismissal, give her lunch, and explain only that a doctor needed to correct an adult misunderstanding. I sent the appointment details to Colin and asked him to authorize release of his transplant records. He did not answer. While I waited, a hotel charge appeared on our joint credit card from a property near Charlottesville. Colin had told me he was attending a late client dinner in Richmond that night. When I asked about the charge, he said Belden must have used the wrong corporate card. The following morning, the digital hotel folio appeared beneath the charge in the online portal for our joint card, the same account I used to reconcile household travel expenses. The reservation was in Colin's name. The second guest field contained Celeste Rowan. I was still staring at it when my phone vibrated with a message from a number I had never saved. "Dragging a child through another test will not save your marriage. Colin and I are trying to build our future. Stop using Evie to delay what you already know." I read the message once, then took screenshots showing the number, date, and full thread. I forwarded them to Joanne before answering. I never told you there was another test. The typing indicator appeared, disappeared, and did not return. 6 minutes later, Colin called. What did you say to Celeste? I asked how she knew about the consultation. She knows because I told her. You told your vendor about our daughter's private medical appointment? She is not just a vendor. The hotel receipt had already answered that question, but hearing him remove the last disguise still hurt. How long? That is not relevant to the paternity result. It is relevant to why she selected the laboratory, why she knows what sample you gave, and why she is warning me not to verify it. You are trying to make her the villain because you cannot explain the report. I have an explanation worth examining. His silence changed. It was not uncertainty. It was calculation. You will cancel that appointment, he said. No, I said. You are not taking Evie into another laboratory to preserve your story. I am taking our daughter to a qualified professional because you turned an unverified report into permission to reject her. He ended the call. Joanne sent formal preservation requests that afternoon for laboratory communications, joint financial records, and relevant electronic data. She also began the ordinary financial discovery required if Colin intended to separate. I did not empty accounts, hide revenue, or move shared money. I transferred my salary exactly as I always had and documented every household expense. Colin came home 3 nights later, carrying a draft separation proposal. He placed it on the kitchen table, as if he were presenting terms to an underperforming contractor. He wanted the house, the joint brokerage account, and continued use of his executive vehicle. In return, he proposed that I retain Bennett records and compliance and assume most of Evie's daily expenses until parentage was resolved. You wrote this with Celeste, I said. I wrote it with someone who understands what rebuilding will require. I closed the folder without signing it. My attorney will respond. You are going to lose more by making this difficult. I am not negotiating my daughter's identity at the kitchen table. For the first time, I saw that Colin had not merely believed a result. He had begun constructing a new life on top of it, and Celeste knew every room in the structure. The following morning, Dr. Garner sent a short email confirming the consultation and the records she still needed. Her final sentence was the only one I read twice. Until we know whose DNA the blood represented, no one should use that report to make a decision about this child. The next city on Colin's schedule was Phoenix. Evie spent 3 evenings preparing for it. She learned that PHX had once been called Sky Harbor, before commercial aviation became ordinary. She read about the Sonoran Desert, memorized the names of 2 cactus species, and checked the Diamondbacks score, even though she did not care about baseball. On the night Colin returned, she placed a fresh red line across Arizona and waited beside the map with her index card held behind her back. Can I give you my arrival briefing before dinner? She asked. It's exactly 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Colin set his keys on the counter, but did not remove his jacket. What is this supposed to accomplish? Her smile faltered. It's our game. He looked at me instead of her. Are you using Evie to prove something now? I didn't ask her to prepare any of this. She suddenly knows every airport I visit, every team I mention, and every fact about cities I work in. You expect me to believe that's accidental? Evie's hand tightened around the card. You taught me the airport codes. That was before. He stopped there, but the unfinished sentence did its damage. Before the report. Before he decided every shared interest could be evidence of deception. I moved between them without raising my voice. Evie, go put your card with the others. I'll be upstairs in a minute. She did not move immediately. Do you want to hear it or not, Dad? Colin glanced toward his office. Not tonight. Evie folded the card once and walked upstairs. I waited until her bedroom door closed. She learned your language because she loves you. Or because you taught her how to reflect me back at myself. You are punishing an 11-year-old for reminding you of the years you chose to be her father. I did not choose the facts. No. You chose the first explanation that allowed you to stop asking questions. He carried his keys into his office and shut the door. I found Evie sitting on the edge of her bed with the Phoenix card open across her knees. The crease ran through the word achievement. Dad thinks you made me do it, she said. I didn't, and he knows I didn't. Then why does everything I learn make him mad? I sat beside her. Because he is looking at you through something he is afraid of. That is his failure, not yours. She traced PHX with one fingernail. If the real test says I'm his, will he want me again? I wanted to promise her that truth would restore what fear had taken. I wanted to say Colin would see the result, remember every airport call and every bedtime map, and become the man she still waited for. But I had already spent too long translating his choices into kinder meanings. I don't know what your father will choose, I said. I know you will still be loved, and I know you will not have to become a copy of anyone to deserve it. She leaned against my shoulder, but she did not look relieved. The consultation had become more than a medical appointment in her mind. She believed it was the final examination in a class she had never agreed to take. The appointment fell on a Friday, when her school dismissed at 11:15 for a teacher workday. On early release days, Evie usually walked the 0.6 of a mile from school to my office. She had made the route 6 times before, always using the 2 signal-controlled crossings on Grove Avenue. She texted when she left the school gate. My receptionist watched for her through the front windows, and I met her with lunch waiting in the conference room. For September 25, I planned the same routine. We would eat at my office, leave at 12:45, and arrive at Dr. Garner's clinic, well before the 1:30 consultation. I sent the schedule to Colin through the shared family calendar system and copied Joanne on the formal notice. He did not respond that day. 2 evenings later, I attended a Belden commercial community event because Bennett Records handled compliance archiving for one of its construction partners. Colin was across the courtyard, coordinating vendors when a site engineer approached him about transportation. My truck is blocked behind the stage equipment, the man said. Can I use one of the pool vehicles for the warehouse run? Colin opened the fleet application on his phone. You're still approved as a temporary vendor driver? Through the end of the month. Colin selected a vehicle and generated a code. Silver SUV, number 417. The access code expires at 6. Don't let anyone else drive it because the authorization logs to my credentials. The exchange lasted less than a minute. It would not have meant anything to me then, except that Colin repeated the vehicle number when the engineer thanked him. 417, he said. Return it to the Belden lot. I watched the SUV leave through the service gate and return to my client's table. It was simply part of Colin's work, another system he understood well enough to use without thinking. The following week, Joanne called me after reviewing the public records connected to Helix Bridge. There is a financing lien tied to company assets, she said. It does not prove fraud, but it confirms Helix Bridge is carrying substantial bridge debt. How substantial? I asked. Approximately $1.3 to $5 million, based on the filing. Public records tell us the debt exists. They do not tell us the lender's private deadlines, or what Celeste has promised in response. Celeste needs Colin's money. Possibly. Do not convert debt into proof. A lender may request a guarantor with strong income and a credible net worth statement, but we still do not know what Colin has promised, signed, or refused. Joanne's warning was familiar by then. Facts first, interpretation second. I had built my company around the same principle, yet living inside the evidence made restraint harder. The answer arrived during a conference call about the separation proposal. Colin joined from his office with his attorney, Martin Hale. Joanne and I sat together at her conference table. Martin reviewed the assets Colin wanted assigned to him, including the house and the joint brokerage account. Then he opened a lender commitment letter I had not seen before. The review is October 1st, he said. Helix Bridge has until October 5th to provide updated net worth documents and a $650,000 guarantee. They only need proof that I have the capacity, Colin said. Accurate proof. Your salary and present ownership interests may support a guarantee, but this draft settlement does not make the house or brokerage account yours. You can become personally liable before the property division is final. That contract will make Helix Bridge profitable. It may, the risk remains. Colin dismissed the warning with the confidence he once reserved for projects he had studied for months. Celeste knows the company better than anyone. The review is a temporary obstacle. I understood then that he was preparing to put his income and net worth behind a future with Celeste before our marriage was legally separated, using the draft property division to make that future look safer than it was. Joanne touched my wrist beneath the table, reminding me not to react. I let Colin finish. When the call ended, she said, "His attorney gave him competent advice in front of witnesses. What he chooses to do with it is his responsibility." At home, I found Evie standing on a chair beside the wall map. She had added a small white pin near Dr. Garner's clinic. Beneath it, she had taped a handwritten label. 1:30 Tell the truth. "You know this appointment is not a trial," I said. "I know," she answered. "And no result decides whether you belong with me. I know that too." She climbed down and looked at Colin's travel lines. "I just want everyone to have the same truth." On the evening of September 24, Colin finally emailed me. He confirmed he would not attend the consultation. He refused to release his transplant records voluntarily, but wrote that he would accept a court-supervised genetic test if one became necessary. I forwarded the message to Joanne and printed a copy for the appointment file. Evie came into my office carrying her backpack. She had packed a sandwich, her geography notebook, and the Phoenix card Colin had refused to hear. "Do you think Dr. Garner will know tomorrow?" she asked. "She may know what needs to happen next. That is not always the same as having an answer immediately." Evie studied the clinic pin on the map, then turned to me with a fear no child should have needed words for. "What if the truth comes back and he still doesn't choose me?" I did not answer Evie's question with another promise about Colin. I pulled her close and told her the only truth I could guarantee. "Whatever that appointment shows, you will come home with me. Nothing on a laboratory page gets to decide whether you are wanted." The following morning, she left her Phoenix briefing on the kitchen counter. She carried her geography notebook instead, along with a turkey sandwich and the folder Dr. Garner had asked us to bring. Colin had already gone to work. At 11:14, I sent Evie a message from my office. "Text me when you leave the gate. Stay on Grove and use both signals." Her reply arrived a minute later. "Leaving now. 12 minutes. I know the route, Mom." The September sky was clear. There had been no rain, fog, or slick roads to make the crossing unusually dangerous. I placed Evie's lunch on the small conference table and checked the clinic folder again. Her school stood 0.6 of a mile away. She had walked the route on 6 previous early release days, always staying on the main sidewalk and crossing only when the signals changed. At 11:28, my receptionist looked toward the front windows. "Evie usually beats the clock," she said. I smiled automatically and sent another text. "Are you close?" The message showed as delivered but not read. At 11:31, I called. Her phone rang until voicemail answered. I told myself she had stopped to retie a shoe or help another student. At 11:34, I called again. At 11:43, Evie's name appeared on my screen. I answered with relief already in my voice. "Honey, where are you?" A man I did not know said, "Is this Evie's mother? Her lock screen lists you as the emergency contact." My body understood before my mind did. The conference room seemed to tilt under my feet. "Yes, this is her mother. My name is Daniel. Your daughter was hit by a car at the crossing near Grove and Belmont. The ambulance just arrived. She's breathing, but she's hurt." I gripped the edge of the table. "Let me speak to her. She isn't answering us." The paramedics are working on her. The clinic folder slid from my hand. Papers scattered across the carpet, including the consultation confirmation marked for 1:30. I do not remember taking my purse. My receptionist drove because my hands shook too badly to hold my keys. By the time we reached the intersection, police had blocked the nearest lane, and the ambulance was already gone. An officer stopped us before I could leave the car. "They're taking her to VCU Medical Center," he said. "Go directly there. We'll speak with you after the doctors have assessed her." "What hit her?" "A silver SUV. It left the scene." "Did anyone see the driver?" "We're collecting statements now." I wanted to force more answers from him, but every second I spent at that curb was a second farther from Evie. My receptionist turned the car toward the hospital while I called Colin. He answered on the fourth ring. "Evie was hit by a car," I said. "They're taking her to VCU." For several seconds, I heard only his breathing. "Is she conscious?" "No," I said. "They haven't been able to wake her." "I'm coming," he said. The emergency department had already taken Evie for imaging when I arrived. A nurse led me into a consultation room and asked questions I could barely process. Allergies, medications, previous surgeries, when she had last eaten. At 12:09, a trauma surgeon entered with scans on a tablet. "Your daughter has internal bleeding from a tear in the tissue supporting part of her intestine," he said. "There is also an injury to the small bowel. She needs surgery now." The words separated from one another in my head. Internal bleeding. Surgery. Now. He explained that Evie also had a stable pelvic fracture that would probably not require an operation. The immediate danger was inside her abdomen. I signed the consent form at 12:18. A nurse placed my hand on Evie's shoulder for only a few seconds before they moved her toward the operating room. Her face looked too small above the hospital blanket. "I'm here," I told her, though I did not know whether she could hear me. "You are not doing this alone." The operating room doors closed at 12:34. Colin arrived 20 minutes later, with his tie loosened and his face drained of color. For one brief moment, I saw the father Evie remembered. He pressed both hands against the back of his neck and asked the same question 3 times. "Was she awake? Did she say anything? Did she know you were there?" "No." "They took her straight into surgery." He sat beside me and stared at the closed doors. When Detective Andrea Morales came to collect initial information, Colin stood so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. "Did she identify the driver?" he asked. Detective Morales looked from him to me. "Your daughter was not able to give a statement. Witnesses described a silver SUV leaving the intersection. We are checking traffic cameras and nearby businesses." "What kind of SUV?" "We are still confirming the vehicle." At the time, Colin's question did not seem strange. I wanted the same answer. I wanted a license plate, a face, and a reason someone had left an injured child in the road. Detective Morales asked about Evie's route and why she had been walking. I explained the early release routine and the appointment. She wrote down Dr. Garner's address, but did not ask what kind of consultation it was. After she left, Colin's phone began vibrating. He ignored the first 2 calls. On the third, he stepped several feet away, although the waiting area was quiet enough for his side of the conversation to carry. "A garage column?" he said. "How badly is it damaged?" I turned toward him. He lowered his voice. "Don't report anything yet. Let me see what can be handled internally." When he returned, I asked who had called. "Celeste," he said. The name entered the waiting room like something contaminated. "What happened?" "She says one of her creditors cornered her in a parking garage. She panicked while backing out and struck a concrete column. Her clothes were torn during the confrontation, and the vehicle is damaged." "What vehicle?" I asked. "A Belden pool car." My attention returned to the operating room doors. "Then she should report the creditor and the collision. She's afraid the lender will use it against her company." Our daughter is in surgery because someone drove away after hitting her. This is not the moment to help Celeste hide a damaged vehicle. I'm not hiding anything. I'm preventing a vendor problem from becoming a public mess before I know what happened. He opened his laptop on the chair beside him. I watched him enter the fleet system, mark a vehicle as awaiting maintenance, and make a short call to arrange an outside tow. I did not see the fleet number. I only saw Colin giving more concentration to Celeste's damaged car than he had given to the consultation that might have saved his relationship with his daughter. At 3:22, the surgeon returned. Evie had required repair to the injured section of intestine and control of bleeding from the mesenteric tear. The operation had gone as planned. She had lost a significant amount of blood, but she was stable. I began crying before he finished speaking. "She is not out of the woods," he cautioned. "We're moving her to the pediatric ICU. The next several hours matter." They transferred her at approximately 4:05. Tubes and monitor wires surrounded her, and medication kept her deeply asleep. I sat beside the bed and held the part of her hand not covered by tape. Colin stood near the window, answering messages. Celeste called again. Then again. At 4:52, he said Celeste was frightened, trapped in torn clothes and shaking because she had not eaten. I told him to have her call the police. Evie had just survived emergency surgery. His phone vibrated again. He took his keys, and I followed him to the elevators. I asked him once not to leave. He repeated the creditor's story and looked at me without apology. "She has doctors," he said. "My mistress needs me more." At 5:08, the elevator carried him away. I went back to Evie and sat down beside her bed. I did not chase him, call him again, or ask him to reconsider. A choice made only after begging would not have been the choice my daughter deserved. At 5:47, my phone displayed an alert from our joint credit card. L'Arc, French boutique $1,286. While Evie lay unconscious beneath a warming blanket, Colin was buying Celeste new clothes. At 7:18, another charge appeared on our joint account. Calder House Stateroom. Colin had not gone to help Celeste file a police report or arrange a safe ride home. He had bought her more than $1,000 worth of clothes and taken her to one of the most expensive restaurants in Richmond, while Evie lay unconscious in pediatric intensive care. I took screenshots of both transactions and forwarded them to Joanne. Then I turned my phone face down and returned my hand to Evie's, while a nurse checked her dressing, adjusted the warming blanket, and explained that the sedation would be reduced gradually. Colin returned at 9:06 with a valet stamp on his hand, a Lark and Finch receipt in his coat pocket, and the smoky scent of Calder House on his shirt. When he tried to defend the trip by saying Evie had been unconscious, I told him her inability to watch him leave did not make the abandonment smaller. At 9:18, Evie woke in stages. She answered the nurse's questions, found my face, then noticed Colin standing beyond the bed. The hope that rose in her expression lasted only a second. She asked whether she was an unwanted child, and I told her she was the one I would always choose. At 9:27, before Colin could offer an answer of his own, the door opened. Detective Morales entered with another detective and a hospital security supervisor. The three of them remained near the doorway until the nurse confirmed that Evie was stable enough for adults to speak quietly in the room. Morales looked directly at Colin. "Mr. Bennett, we need to speak with you about a silver Belden commercial SUV, fleet number 417. Every trace of irritation disappeared from his face. "Vehicle 417? He repeated. "A school bus camera gave us the Belden logo and enough of the plate to contact the company's on-call fleet manager," she said. His preliminary check matched it to vehicle 417. "Your credentials generated a temporary access code at 10:52 this morning, and at 11:36 that vehicle struck your daughter at Grove and Belmont." Colin gripped the back of the visitor's chair. "That isn't possible. Did you authorize someone to use it?" He looked at me briefly before answering. "Celeste Rowan. She is an approved vendor." The detective beside Morales opened a notebook. When did Miss Rowan return the vehicle? She said she left it in Franklin Garage before 11. That was not what he had told me during Evie's surgery. He had said Celeste struck a concrete column while escaping a creditor. He had used his laptop to mark the damaged vehicle for maintenance and arranged an outside tow. Now, after learning that the same vehicle had hit our daughter, he was describing it as stolen from a garage. Morales did not challenge him immediately. When did she report the theft? This evening. She was frightened and confused. Did she contact Belden Security or law enforcement? I filed the company incident report for her. What time? Morales asked. I would have to check. Please do not delete or alter anything while checking. Morales's voice remained controlled. We will need your phone, laptop, fleet communications, and the original email or message in which Miss Rowan reported the vehicle stolen. Colin's hand moved toward his coat pocket. Morales raised one palm. Do not contact Miss Rowan to compare accounts. Do not advise her what we asked, and do not instruct anyone at Belden to change or remove fleet records. You are treating us like suspects because a company vehicle was stolen. We are preserving evidence in a serious hit and run involving a child. No one is being arrested in this room. Evie shifted beneath the blanket. Her breathing changed, and the nurse stepped between the detectives and the bed. That is enough for now, she said. The patient needs quiet. Morales handed Colin a card and asked him to remain available. Before leaving, she looked at me. We will contact you separately, Mrs. Bennett. Do not question Evie about the driver. Let the medical team tell us when she is ready. After the door closed, I forwarded Detective Morales the 2 joint card alerts from Lark and Finch and Calderhouse, then saved the confirmation that she had received them. Colin pulled out his phone, turned slightly away from me, and typed with both thumbs. Detective Morales told you not to contact Celeste, I said. I am telling her not to panic. You are helping her hold together a story that changed the moment police walked in. She made a mistake. A stolen vehicle is not the same thing as hitting a garage column. She was terrified. She may not have understood what happened. You knew enough to hide the damage before you knew that vehicle had struck Evie. Now you know, and you are still protecting her. His face hardened. Do not destroy 2 companies over one mistake. I stared at him. Our daughter was cut open because of that mistake. Belden employs hundreds of people. Helix Bridge coordinates care for families who need it. If you turn this into a public accusation before the facts are clear, the police brought the facts into this room. Your credential released the vehicle. Celeste had it. You helped move it outside the normal system, and now you are giving investigators a different story. Evie made a frightened sound behind us. Her eyes were open again, but she was not looking at either of us. The argument had tightened her entire body around the pain in her abdomen. I pressed the call button. When the nurse arrived, I asked to speak outside. The charge nurse and hospital security supervisor met me in the corridor. I did not demand that the hospital erase Colin's parental rights. I explained that the police had connected a vehicle he authorized to Evie's injuries, that he was arguing beside her bed, and that her distress was affecting her recovery. The hospital placed a temporary visitor restriction on him pending a safety review. He could receive medical updates because he remained Evie's legal father, but he could not return to the bedside that night. Colin called the restriction vindictive. I watched security escort him toward the elevators without answering. The next morning, Joanne arrived before 8, with a legal pad and a paper cup of coffee I never opened. She had already begun preparing an emergency petition for temporary custody and supervised visitation. This is not a final custody decision, she warned. We are asking the court to protect Evie while the investigation develops. File it, I said. And the separation date? I looked through the glass at my daughter, sleeping beneath a pale hospital blanket. September 26th, I said. Yesterday was the last day of our marriage, even if the court needs another year to make it official. When Evie woke again, her first question was not about the vehicle or the detectives. Did we miss Dr. Garner? Yes, we did. Her eyes filled before she looked away. Then we still don't know if Dad is really my dad. I sat beside her and took her hand. We know he raised you for 11 years. We know what he chose yesterday. The rest can wait until your body is stronger. My phone rang before she could answer. Detective Morales' name appeared on the screen. I stepped only far enough away to keep my voice from waking Evie fully. Belden finished the first route check from its fleet system, Morales said. Vehicle 417 never entered Franklin Garage yesterday morning. I looked through the window at Colin's empty chair. The theft story had not begun with a stolen car. It had begun with a lie. Evie remained in pediatric intensive care for 36 hours before the doctors transferred her to a regular surgical floor. She spent 8 days in the hospital altogether. The stable pelvic fracture made every movement painful, and the abdominal incision prevented her from sitting up without help. She hated the breathing exercises, feared the sound of rolling carts, and woke crying whenever headlights crossed the wall. She did not ask about Colin again during those first days. I did not ask whether she had seen the driver. Detective Morales had warned me that frightened adults could change a child's memory simply by repeating the same question. When Evie's surgeon approved it, a trained forensic interviewer met with her once in a quiet hospital room. I watched through a window with Joanne and Morales. Evie remembered the silver vehicle. She remembered the engine rising in pitch instead of slowing. She also remembered a woman calling out through an open window moments before the impact. The voice sounded like someone I knew, she said, but I couldn't see her face. The interviewer did not ask Evie to guess who it was. Morales later told me the memory might help guide the investigation, but it would not be treated as proof of the driver's identity. That restraint mattered to me. Evie had already been made to feel responsible for proving who her father was. I would not let another investigation turn her into the person responsible for proving who had hurt her. 3 days after we returned home, Morales asked Joanne and me to meet at police headquarters. Evie stayed with my sister while I sat beneath fluorescent lights and watched the shopping trip and dinner transform into something far darker than betrayal. A school bus traveling behind the silver SUV had captured part of the license plate and the Belden logo before the collision. Traffic cameras then placed Fleet Vehicle 417 on Grove Avenue near Evie's school. Belden's telematics records showed that the SUV had been opened with the temporary code generated under Colin's credentials. It left the company lot, traveled toward the school, and stopped near the route Evie walked to my office. It never entered Franklin Garage. Police found it at an independent tow yard nearly 20 miles away. The tow request had been arranged through the maintenance order Colin created while Evie was in surgery. Badge records and exterior cameras later showed Celeste entering a private Helix Bridge training suite shortly after noon and remaining there until Colin collected her that evening, explaining the hours between the collision and the shopping trip, without requiring anyone to guess what she had been thinking. Colin claims Celeste told him the vehicle had been stolen after she left it in the garage, I said. Morales turned one page in her file. His first maintenance note says collision with a concrete structure. The theft report was created later. After obtaining a warrant, investigators downloaded the vehicle's event data recorder. Morales was careful about what it could and could not prove. It cannot identify the driver, she said. It records what the vehicle did. The SUV accelerated as it approached the crosswalk. There was no hard braking before it struck Evie. Braking began only after the impact. The driver's airbag had deployed. A blood trace recovered from it matched the reference sample collected from Celeste under warrant. The seat position was also consistent with someone of her height, although Morales called that supporting evidence rather than identification. The joint card screenshots I had sent Morales gave investigators the store and restaurant names before the records could cycle out. The next video came from Lark and Finch. Celeste entered the boutique at 5:31 that evening. Her left wrist was scraped, and she wore clothing covered by a long coat, despite the mild weather. Colin arrived minutes later. The recording showed Celeste selecting an entirely new outfit, including shoes. At the counter, She asked the sales associate to discard everything she had worn into the store. The boutique had a policy for clothing that appeared contaminated with blood. The manager sealed it in a marked bag and placed it in a secured storage area for biohazard pickup the following morning. Police reached the store first. The clothing carried Celeste's blood, fragments of safety glass and residue consistent with a deployed airbag. None of those details stood alone, but together they placed her inside a recently crashed vehicle before Colin took her shopping. Morales then opened the restaurant footage. Calderhouse had seated Colin and Celeste at table 12. At 7:46, while Colin sat across from her beneath a brass pendant lamp, someone used the restaurant's Wi-Fi to send Belden a theft report from Colin's work account. The email claimed Celeste had left vehicle 417 inches Franklin Garage before 11 and discovered it missing later. Restaurant records, Wi-Fi logs, and email metadata placed both of them together when the false report was sent. The dinner charge that had felt like an insult beside Evie's hospital bed was also a timestamp. Colin changed his explanation after the police showed him the evidence. He admitted that Celeste had originally reported striking a concrete column while escaping a threatening creditor. He said he had believed her and filed the theft story to prevent damage to Belden's reputation until the vehicle could be inspected privately. He claimed he had not known the damaged SUV was the one that struck Evie. Joanne arranged for me to hear that statement in a recorded meeting attended by counsel. Colin sat across from me, with Martin Hale beside him. I made a terrible decision before I understood what had happened, Colin said. Celeste told me she was being threatened. I thought I was containing a corporate problem. You learned at 9:27 that vehicle 417 hit Evie, I said. His gaze dropped briefly. You contacted Celeste after Detective Morales told you not to. You repeated the theft story, and you asked Belden employees not to release records until the next morning. I was trying to understand what she had done. No? You were trying to preserve the lie after you knew who had been hurt. He looked at Martin, but his attorney did not rescue him. Belden suspended Colin, pending an internal investigation. The company did not fire him immediately, and the police did not arrest him in the conference room. The systems moved more slowly than anger, gathering records and separating panic from intent. Colin responded by filing a petition asking the family court to relieve him of legal paternity. He attached the original laboratory report and requested a court-supervised genetic test, arguing that he should not be responsible for future child support if Evie was not biologically his. The court appointed a guardian ad litem to represent Evie's interests. The filing did not end Colin's support obligations, remove Evie from his insurance, or erase 11 years of legal fatherhood. Joanne requested that any testing use a transplant-aware protocol. She also sought temporary custody for me and supervised visitation for Colin while the hit-and-run investigation continued. When I told Evie that a lawyer had been appointed solely to protect her, she asked whether that meant she had done something wrong. It means the adults are finally required to make decisions around what is best for you, I said. Colin continued pushing the property settlement while the paternity petition moved forward. He wanted the house, the leveraged brokerage account, and the executive vehicle. His own attorney warned him in writing that his salary and present net worth interests might qualify him to sign for Helix Bridge, but the draft settlement did not prove that the house or brokerage account belonged to him alone. Any guarantee he signed would still be his personal risk. Colin signed the guarantee before the lender's October 5th cure deadline anyway. I agreed that the marriage was over. I did not agree to distribute property without complete disclosure, independent valuation, and a lawful agreement. I would not hide debts from him, but I would not carry obligations he had chosen for Celeste's company. Near the end of October, Joanne placed 2 files beside each other on her desk. The first was Colin's paternity report. The second contained the records of the stem cell transplant Nolan had given him 22 years earlier. She rested one finger on the blank medical history box. He asked the court to test whether he is Evie's father, she said. This time, the court will test Colin, not Nolan's blood. The guardian ad litem did not approve another genetic test simply because Colin requested one. She met with Evie privately, reviewed the first laboratory report, and spoke with Dr. Garner about the effect of Colin's transplant history. Her recommendation allowed testing only if the process protected Evie from repeated collections, limited access to her genetic information, and used a laboratory qualified to distinguish Colin's original genetic profile from the donor-derived cells in his blood. Evie asked me whether she would have to go back to the clinic where we had been headed when Celeste struck her. No, I told her. This time the adults are bringing the correct process to you. The collection took place in December at a forensic genetics facility selected through the court. Joanne attended for me. Colin had his attorney. The guardian ad litem remained present for every step involving Evie. A technician checked our identification, photographed the sealed collection kits, and recorded each transfer. Evie and I provided cheek swabs. Nolan came separately and submitted his own sample so the laboratory could identify the genetic profile created by the stem cells he had donated to Colin 22 years earlier. Colin's collection required more care. The laboratory did not rely on another blood draw. It also refused to treat an ordinary cheek swab as automatically reliable because donor and recipient cells could appear together after a stem cell transplant. Under supervision, technicians removed several hairs from Colin's scalp, with their roots intact. Nolan's buccal profile and the preserved transplant HLA and chimerism records helped the laboratory rule out donor-derived contamination and confirm that the hair root profile was recipient origin. The actual paternity comparison then used the forensic markers recovered from Colin's follicles alongside Evie's sample and mine. The explanation took minutes. Waiting for the result took weeks. Evie returned to school part-time before Christmas. She still used a cushion beneath the seatbelt, and I drove through Grove and Belmont only when necessary. At every crosswalk, her shoulders rose before the car stopped. She never asked whether the laboratory had finished. Instead, she began removing the arrival briefings from the wall map and placing them inside a shoebox. "I don't want to throw them away," she said. "I just don't want them watching me." I understood exactly what she meant. The first report had hung over our house like a verdict. Even after Colin left, Evie still behaved as though some invisible examiner might appear and tell her she had studied the wrong cities. The new report arrived in January, through Joanne's secure case portal. She asked me to come to her office rather than reading it alone. Dr. Garner joined us by video. The guardian ad litem attended as well, because the result belonged to Evie's case before it belonged to either parent's argument. Joanne placed the original report on one side of the table and the new report on the other. The first laboratory compared Evie with DNA obtained from Colin's blood, Dr. Garner said. That blood profile was consistent with Nolan's donor-derived cells. I looked at the zero Colin had used to dismantle our family. So the test excluded Nolan as Evie's father. In practical terms, yes. It answered whether the donor-derived profile in Colin's blood was her biological father. That was the wrong question. She turned to the second report. The recipient origin profile recovered from Colin's hair follicles was compared with Mara, Evie, and the relevant family samples. The result supports Colin Bennett as Evie's biological father at the probability level reported by the laboratory. For several seconds, no one spoke. I had imagined that moment so many times. I thought vindication would feel like warmth, or release, or justice finally entering the room. Instead, I saw Evie folding her Phoenix briefing, while Colin accused her of imitating him. I saw her hospital bed and his empty chair. I heard her asking how much more she needed to learn. The result proved that I had told the truth. It did not return what Colin had taken from her, while refusing to verify it. He was her father all along, I said. Dr. Garner's expression remained gentle. Biologically, yes. That afternoon, Colin's attorney requested immediate contact with Evie. Colin argued that the temporary restrictions had been based partly on the disputed paternity issue and that the result should restore his ordinary parental access. The guardian ad litem disagreed. The genetic result resolves one question, she said during the conference. It does not resolve the child's medical trauma, the pending criminal investigation, or Mr. Bennett's conduct after the collision. Supervised visitation remained in place. Evie's therapist would determine when direct contact could occur without harming her recovery. Colin called me through the attorney-approved line that evening. I need to speak to her. You need to follow the order. She is my daughter. She was your daughter before this report. His breathing changed. I was given false information. You refused independent testing. You blamed her for reminding you of yourself. You left her in intensive care. Celeste arranged the test. She manipulated the process. You still made every choice that followed. The laboratory records obtained through subpoena soon showed that Celeste's role had gone beyond recommending a convenient vendor. Weeks before Colin's blood was submitted, an account tied to Helix Bridge had asked the laboratory's general vendor support channel whether blood collected after a sibling stem cell transplant could reflect the donor's genotype. The response warned that transplant history could affect interpretation and recommended consultation before using blood for relationship testing. The actual order was later routed through a separate executive screening workflow, where that support exchange did not automatically appear. Celeste directed the intake staff to use Colin's blood sample and reported on the request form that there was no relevant transplant history. The laboratory had not invented a result. Celeste had selected a sample she already knew might represent Nolan and withheld the fact needed to interpret it properly. During a recorded interview attended by counsel, Colin admitted he had told her everything. He had described the cancer treatment, Nolan's donation, and the doctor who once joked that his blood now carried his brother's genetic signature. He had also told her about our years of infertility and the timing of my pregnancy. You knew she had all that information, I said. I thought she was helping me find the truth. Then why didn't you call Nolan? Why didn't you call your transplant clinic when I showed you the blank box? He looked down at his hands. Because if they said the report was unreliable, I would have to reconsider everything. What did you mean by everything? I asked. Your pregnancy. The years I thought people felt sorry for me. The possibility that I had built my life around something that wasn't mine. You preferred a story that let you hate us. His eyes lifted then, but he did not deny it. The report made sense, he said. No, it made your fear feel justified. I explained the result to Evie with Dr. Garner's help. We told her that Colin's treatment had changed the genetic profile in his blood, and the first test had used the wrong kind of sample for someone with his medical history. She listened quietly. So, Uncle Nolan's blood answered instead of Dad's. That is a simple way to understand it, Dr. Garner said. The second laboratory made sure it tested your father's original profile. Evie looked at me. Then I didn't fail. No test was ever yours to pass. Her mouth trembled, but she did not cry. If I was his all along, why did he stop being my dad? I took her hand, the same way I had in intensive care. DNA can explain why a report was wrong. It cannot explain away what a person chose to do. Only your father is responsible for that. My phone rang before we left Dr. Garner's office. Detective Morales asked whether I could speak privately. The warrant return from Celeste's phone came in, she said. There is something you need to know before the next interview. For several days before Evie was struck, Celeste had searched the walking route from her school to my office, the timing of the crossing signal at Grove and Belmont, and the words, "School Early Release Richmond." Detective Morales did not call Celeste's search history proof of attempted murder. She placed the records beside the other evidence and explained what each one could establish. For 5 days before Evie was struck, Celeste had searched the walking route between the school and my office, the early release schedule, and the timing of the signal at Grove and Belmont. Her location history showed repeated visits to the intersection. On the morning of the collision, her phone traveled with vehicle 417 from the Belden lot toward Evie's school. Traffic footage placed the SUV on the same route before it accelerated into the crosswalk. The searches alone do not tell us exactly what outcome she intended, Morales said. But the preparation, acceleration, absence of braking before impact, flight from the scene and later concealment are not consistent with an ordinary accident. I looked at the printed map and imagined Celeste sitting near the crossing, watching children leave school, while Evie walked toward an appointment that could expose the paternity report. Whatever degree of injury Celeste had expected, she had used my daughter's body as a way to buy time. In February, after Evie's surgeon and therapist agreed she could tolerate one follow-up interview, the forensic interviewer met with her again. No one showed her Celeste's photograph or suggested a name. Evie described the silver hood, the windshield, and a woman leaning forward over the steering wheel. She remembered the woman's face only for a moment. "I knew her from Dad's company dinner," Evie said. "She was the lady who kept touching his arm." Her statement was treated as supporting evidence, not the foundation of the case. By then, investigators already had vehicle data: Celeste's blood on the airbag, phone location records, traffic video, and the cover-up that followed. A grand jury returned indictments arising from the collision, the hit and run, and the concealment of evidence. Celeste surrendered through her attorney at the courthouse. There were no cameras waiting in a hospital corridor and no dramatic confrontation beside Evie's bed. I learned about it from Morales after it was done. The financial investigation took longer. Helix Bridge had reported receivables that were far larger than the payments it could realistically collect. Those inflated figures helped support approximately $1.35 million in bridge debt. The October 1st lender review demanded updated net worth documentation and a personal guarantee of roughly $650,000 with a cure deadline of October 5th. The lender did not require Colin to own our house or brokerage account outright. His salary and existing ownership interests were enough to make him useful, while the draft separation proposal made his financial position look cleaner and more predictable. Celeste needed him emotionally committed, alienated from me and willing to sign. A transplant-aware consultation threatened all three because it could expose the report, restore his doubt about her, and make him withdraw before the deadline. The dates made the structure clear. The consultation with Dr. Garner had been scheduled for September 25th. Evie was struck that morning. Colin declared our permanent separation the following day. On October 5th, after Martin Hale warned him in writing about the risk, Colin signed the Helix Bridge guarantee. In the settlement, the obligation was treated as Colin's separate responsibility because he signed it after our permanent separation for Celeste's company, without benefit to our household. I had not hidden it, transferred it, or trapped him into accepting it. Every document appeared in discovery. Colin began cooperating with prosecutors after the evidence against Celeste became impossible to explain away. He provided laboratory communications and admitted she had encouraged him to use his executive screening blood. He also tried to portray himself as another person she had deceived. Celeste answered through the cloud backup of her phone. Among the recovered messages was one Colin sent after Detective Morales entered Evie's ICU room and identified vehicle 417. "I told them you reported it stolen before noon. Keep the story straight." I read the message in Joanne's office. Before 9:27 that night, Colin could still claim Celeste had lied to him about striking a garage column. He could say he had misused the fleet system because he believed he was containing an embarrassing vendor incident. After the police told him the SUV had hit Evie, that excuse ended. He knew the damaged vehicle had nearly killed his daughter. He contacted Celeste anyway, supplied a false timeline, and tried to preserve her story. He had made the same moral choice twice. First, he chose Celeste over Evie's bedside. Then, after learning who had placed Evie there, he chose Celeste over the truth. Belden completed its internal investigation in March. The company terminated Colin for misuse of a fleet vehicle, filing a false report and violating evidence preservation instructions. Helix Bridge defaulted soon afterward. Its lender began pursuing Colin under the personal guarantee he had signed despite his attorney's warning. None of that made the divorce settlement automatic. A forensic valuation determined that Bennett Records and Compliance had increased in value during the marriage, partly because of my work. Although I had founded the company before marrying Colin and maintained separate books, a portion of its appreciation was considered in the marital calculation. I kept the company, but I did not keep every dollar of its increased value by pretending the marriage had contributed nothing. The settlement used other assets and a structured payment to offset Colin's share. Colin still wanted the house. Losing his job and assuming the Helix Bridge guarantee made refinancing impossible. Under the agreement, the house was sold and the net equity was divided according to the settlement. I moved Evie into a smaller home near her school. She did not ask about the square footage or the sale price. She asked whether the street had a signal-controlled crossing. By June, most communication with Colin passed through our attorneys. His supervised contact with Evie remained subject to her therapist, the guardian ad litem, and the court. Evie had exchanged 2 short letters with him, but had chosen not to meet in person. During one settlement conference, Colin asked Joanne to carry a message to me. "He wants you to tell Evie that Celeste deceived him," Joanne said. "He believes she should understand that he was acting on false information." I agreed to answer through counsel. "The first lie may have been hers," I said. "The choices after it were yours." Colin requested a brief attorney-supervised call with me. I accepted because Joanne remained on the line. "I thought Evie wasn't mine," he said. "You cannot pretend that did not matter. You had 11 years of being her father before one report. The report did not teach you how to leave." I was humiliated. "So you gave the humiliation to a child." "I came back to the hospital." "You came back after shopping and dinner. Then the police told you Celeste's vehicle had struck Evie, and you still protected her." He did not answer. For months, Colin had blamed a laboratory report, Celeste's manipulation, and my refusal to surrender quietly. In the silence that followed, there was nowhere left to place the decision, except with the man who had made it. That evening, I found Evie standing before the wall map. Most of Colin's old travel pins remained, but she had removed the final one, the Phoenix pin she had placed shortly before the collision. She held it between her fingers for a moment, then dropped it into the shoebox with the arrival briefings. "Do you want me to take the whole map down?" I asked. Evie studied the red lines, the airport codes, and the cities she had once learned to make herself easier for her father to love. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I want it to be mine." The map stayed on Evie's wall through the summer. She removed Colin's flight paths one at a time, not in anger, and not all at once. Some days she could pull down 3 red strings. On other days, touching a single pin was enough to make her close the bedroom door and sit with her therapist's breathing exercise until the tightness in her chest passed. By October, more than a year had passed since the collision. Evie could walk without assistance and had returned to a full school schedule, but recovery had not erased what happened. A pale scar crossed her lower abdomen. Her hips still ached after long days. When a car rolled too quickly toward a crosswalk, her shoulders lifted and her hand reached for mine before she seemed aware of doing it. We did not call those moments setbacks. Her therapist called them reminders from a nervous system that had once been given a good reason to fear. Evie was learning that a reminder was not the same as danger, but no one promised her that one conversation, one court order, or one loving home would make every reminder disappear. On the 18th of October 2027, Joanne and I walked out of the courthouse, carrying the final divorce decree. Colin and I had lived separately without interruption since September 26 of the previous year. The judge did not deliver a speech about betrayal or ask me to forgive anyone. She reviewed the agreement, confirmed that both sides understood it, and signed the order that made legal what Evie and I had already been living for months. Bennett Records and Compliance remained mine, after an independent valuation and an equalization that credited Colin with his lawful share of the company's marital appreciation. The house was sold when he could not refinance it. Its debts and sale expenses were paid, and the remaining equity and joint accounts were divided with every balance disclosed. The Helix Bridge guarantee stayed with Colin because he had signed it after our permanent separation for a company in which I had no ownership and from which our household received no benefit. I did not celebrate when the lender pursued him. I simply refused to confuse his consequence with my cruelty. The custody order gave me primary legal authority over Evie's medical care and education. Colin was not permanently barred from her life by a dramatic restraining order. Any contact had to be supervised or therapeutic, had to meet the conditions set by the court and her treatment team, and could proceed only when Evie was ready. She was not ready. Colin had sent 2 letters through the approved channel. Evie read neither at first. Weeks later, she opened one during therapy and stopped after the first paragraph. No one made her continue. The criminal cases had not reached a clean ending by the day my divorce became final. Celeste still faced the collision, hit and run, evidence, and financial charges, while Colin's lawyer was discussing a possible resolution of the false report and obstruction case. No sentence had been imposed, and his cooperation had not erased the message telling Celeste to keep the story straight. He had lost his position at Belden, remained responsible for the guarantee debt, and could no longer present himself as a man who had merely trusted the wrong woman. The first lie had opened the door. He had chosen to keep walking through it. After court, Joanne asked whether I wanted to mark the day with lunch. I promised Evie I'd be home before she finished her project, I said. The project was called Where I Want to Go. Each student had to choose 3 destinations, explain what drew them there, and build a visual route beginning from Richmond. When I reached our house, Evie had spread her supplies across the dining table. The old wall map lay flat in front of her. The red strings Colin once followed had been removed, leaving tiny holes across the paper. Nolan sat at the far end of the table, drinking coffee while Evie searched through a box of pins. He had called occasionally during her recovery, asked about physical therapy, and sent her a geography puzzle for her birthday. Months earlier, Evie had lent him her atlas so he could build that puzzle without folding her wall map. He never called himself the man Colin should have been, and I never placed him in that role. I came to return your atlas, he said to Evie. Your mother tells me you are planning an ambitious escape. It is an academic escape, she said. There are citations. Nolan smiled, asked whether her hip was bothering her after school, and listened when she answered. Then he left before dinner, hugging her only after she stepped toward him first. A padded envelope had arrived that afternoon through Joanne's office. The return label carried Colin's attorney's name. Inside was an old luggage tag from a trip to Boston, the first one Colin had mailed Evie when she was 6. A short note said he thought she might want it for her map. Evie held the tag for a long time. Do I have to send something back? She asked. You do not owe anyone a reply, I said. Do I have to hang it up? The map belongs to you. You decide what goes on it. She opened the shoebox containing the old arrival briefings and placed the luggage tag inside. She did not destroy it. She did not turn it into proof that everything had been repaired. She simply decided where it belonged. Then she returned to her project. Her first destination was Chincoteague, near the Virginia coast. She wanted to see the barrier islands, draw the shoreline, and find out whether the wild ponies looked as stubborn in person as they did in photographs. Her second was Iceland, because she loved the idea of standing near the boundary between tectonic plates. She had drawn arrows showing how the land shifted and written a note about geothermal energy in the margin. Her third choice was Santa Fe. What is the geographic reason? I asked. There isn't one yet, she said. I like how the name sounds. That is allowed? My teacher said curiosity counts. She drew new lines from Richmond, but none of them followed Colin's business routes. The nearest path curved east toward the coast. Another crossed the Atlantic. The last stretched west toward New Mexico. At school the following week, families were invited to view the projects. Evie stood beside her map while a classmate studied the 3 routes. Why do you like maps so much? The girl asked. A year earlier, Evie might have spoken about airport codes or the cities her father visited. She might have explained how memorizing another person's world made her feel closer to him. This time, she looked at the open spaces between her pins. Because a map shows there is always more than one way to go. I felt something inside me settle. For years, I had believed Colin's presence made our home safe, simply because he still came through the door. I had measured family by who remained under the roof, even while Evie was learning to shrink herself for the person living there. I knew better now. Presence without protection was not safety. A complete-looking family could still leave a child alone, while a smaller one could teach her that love did not have to be earned. That evening, Evie carried the map back to her room. Together, we hung it above her desk. The old holes remained visible, but she did not cover them. They were part of the paper, not instructions for what had to be placed there again. She picked up the blue pin for Chincoteague and pressed it into the coast. "Where do you want to start?" I asked. She touched the first route with one finger. "Somewhere I chose." For years, my daughter had used a map to prove she belonged in her father's world. That fall, she used it for something far more important. She chose a world of her own,